Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this Cultured Meat Symposium for hosting this event with such enthusiasm, even in this difficult time with COVID-19. We're all digging deep right now to find ways to keep our top priorities moving forward, and I'm so glad to see the passion and energy from you all in this field. I'm honored to be your keynote speaker today, and I hope that my perspectives that I share with you on this upcoming push towards commercialization for cell-based meat will resonate with you and help energize you for this next hill that we all need to climb. Just a bit of background on how I came to the field of cell-based meat. For all of my career, my job has been to develop, optimize, scale, and manufacture robust cell culture processes. I've worked from the bench to some of the largest cell culture manufacturing plants on the planet with a goal of ensuring that robust processes were implemented to manufacture safe products that help people. I joined Memphis Meat specifically to help develop massively scalable cell-based processes for making meat. The mission of my work has always been a critical motivator in my career. We work way too hard to not care about the why. And now I'm finally so excited to be leading the design and construction of our new Memphis Meats pilot manufacturing facility. We've built an amazing team at Memphis Meats, and we have some great partners in design and construction helping us bring our pilot plant to life. During my career, I've been part of multiple large manufacturing plant startups, and I know firsthand there is a challenging road ahead that will take even more talented and dedicated individuals to move from here to meat going out the door, but we're well on our way. So, as you all know, our industry is growing at an incredible pace. By our count, there are now over 50 cell-based meat companies in the world, and disclosed investment dollars are nearing 500 million. We've all started with a similar idea, that we could take cells from animals typically consumed as food and grow them outside the animal in clean processes to make meat without the need for animal agriculture and slaughter. From that first idea, we secured investments and then all started out in our labs and small kitchens to create the first prototypes and the first taste of a food that was both novel and revolutionary, but at the same time familiar and already part of our culture. From the success of those prototypes, our next steps will be maturing our processes and scaling into production. And then, as our markets grow, we'll be solving the kinds of challenges of other more mature commodity industries to become a significant part of feeding a population that will be 10 billion people by 2050. So for Memphis Meats, this pilot plant will be our launching pad into commercialization. And while that is a tremendously exciting step to be taking, those first commercial moments will invite public scrutiny and questions on a global scale. And as an industry, we all need to be ready to answer them. Questions like, is it safe? Is it meat? How much does it cost? How much can you make? And is it delicious? We're all going to be engaging in the public in a much more direct way. And they're going to demand some degree of transparency about how their food gets to the plate. We'll be engaging with investors and partners and other business opportunities where the expectations for a fiscally sound business plan are table stakes for those conversations. We'll be working with regulators on a global stage and at all levels, from local city health inspectors to the highest centralized authorities. We'll be both teachers and students as we establish this new paradigm and reach agreement on its appropriate risks and controls. We need to be ready to tell the story of cell-based meat with data and evidence of a safe, delicious product from an emerging industry that's economically viable and ready to grow. As an industry, we all stand to benefit together when we do these things effectively. So, clearly, the path to commercialization is something that we're talking about every day, as I'm sure everyone at this conference is. We know it's going to take massive parallel lifts across multiple focus areas that all need to converge together into our goal. In my talk today, I'd like to spend some time with you discussing the 4 key pillars that we think about on a daily basis: scalable processes, positive economics, regulatory clearance, and consumer acceptance. I'll admit, it can feel a bit overwhelming at times to be tackling all these things at once, but at the same time, we can't see getting to commercialization without them. So scalable processes, let's start here. Each of us in the industry might be planning different means of making our products, and that's part of the exciting landscape of all that's happening in this field. But whatever way you're going to do it, our production platforms must be both technically robust, meaning consistent product run after run after run, and they must demonstrate massively scalable principles to be relevant for food production. So the scale of food is large, and humans are typically very bad at imagining the scale of very big things. And the global food industry, like I said, it's massive. So here's a quick analogy to help us try to think about this. The average person in the US, that's average guy there, green guy, average person eats roughly 200 pounds of meat a year. So for a relative size, you might imagine that as a decent little rowboat, maybe something you'd take out on the lake with friends. When most of us are making our meat in our processes today, it's not so hard to think about making that much. But in the US, we produce approximately 100 billion pounds of meat, beef, pork, and poultry every year. A Nimitz-class aircraft carrier weighs about 100 million pounds. So now we're talking about 1,000 aircraft carriers. That's your 100 billion pounds. For cell-based meat to capture 1% of the meat market, we need to be thinking about making the equivalent of 10 aircraft carriers worth of meat from our processes every year. That is massive. The point is that the food industry operates at huge scales, but there's plenty of space for new players like Memphis Meats and others in cell-based meat. But when we're thinking about our processes, we have to be aiming large. So what are processes that scale? When I first came to this field from my history in biopharma, I thought, I've been working in some of the largest cell culture production facilities on the planet. I know what large is. But when you start digging into it, you realize even the total global biopharma cell culture capacity is a drop in the bucket when it comes to the scale of food. So I'll take you through another little thought exercise. For mammalian cell culture, the largest and really today the only use of it is in the biopharma industry. Globally, there are approximately 5 million liters of existing installed manufacturing capacity. If you were growing cells in a continuous perfusion process at moderately high densities, you might be at 10% cell mass by volume. So you're harvesting 500,000 kigs every day, or roughly 1 million pounds. Now, Americans eat roughly 1/4 pound of meat every day. So that 1 million pounds really just meets the meat demand of about 4 million people, a city like Los Angeles. So even today, the largest total installed global capacity for mammalian cell culture, like I said, it's a drop in the bucket. But suspension culture, like is used in most of those bioprocesses, is something that's been proven to scale. Suspension culture is generally performed using some means of agitation to distribute cells as well as their oxygen and other nutrients homogeneously inside of a culture vessel. Currently, mammalian cell culture bioreactors have a demonstrated maximum of about 25,000 liters. But in the biopharma industry where they're used, each and every time a bigger unit has been installed, it's worked. So I wouldn't say we found the limit yet. Suspension culture for microbes has been pushed even further. Over 500,000 liters is typical for tanks of that size for the biggest industries. Pursuit of cost-effective bio-derived products is required at that scale. As you know, the corn bioproduct is one of the biggest success stories for cultured biomass grown in bioreactors and made into food products. So there is evidence that scaling these bioprocesses can be relevant for food. Scaling up processes is much more straightforward for a homogeneous suspension culture than is generally true for something more complex, like making a muscle tissue. A lot of what's been written today about cell-based meat production methods has described the use of 3D scaffolds or other means of culture growth that are more analogous to the tissue engineering field that currently exists today predominantly in the regenerative medicine space, where they're developing new ways to make functional tissues and organs for transplantation. To make meat this way requires massive scaling of these relatively novel culture techniques. There are a number of published hypotheses on how we'll all get there: scaffolding, 3D printing, vessel angiogenesis, etc. There's a lot of work to be done to scale these types of non-homogeneous tissue cultures, but we're excited about the possibilities of meat products that can be made this way. In addition to scaling our processes, another important element of being ready to scale are our supply chains of raw materials. For many researchers in the lab, you may be ordering components for your cell feeds in 500-gram bottles, but eventually we need to be talking about rail cars and barges to get the raw materials we need to produce meaningful amounts of meat. Supply chains must be ready to adapt and in some cases grow with us. The largest non-water constituent of meat is protein. And proteins are made of amino acids. There are roughly 20 of these common building blocks that make up all of our proteins. Our feeds for the cultivation process contain large amounts of these amino acids. A few of them, like lysine and methionine, are already made in very large quantities, often using fermentation for use in animal feeds. These amino acid providers will need to scale the other amino acids to match the requirements of our processes. Other crude sources of amino acids and other nutrients, such as hydrolysates, exist at massive scales for the food and livestock feed markets. Many feed formulations for cell-based meat are looking to incorporate these cost-effective sources of nutrients, and they've already been successfully used in mammalian cell cultures and biopharma for decades. And finally, recombinant proteins, such as amylases and proteases, are already used widely in food today, and they're made at massive scale in highly cost-effective manners. So we're going to need to partner with our suppliers to help them understand our needs and our projections for future growth. All right, so let's talk about costs. In order to convince our customers and our investors that we're a viable industry, we have to be able to show a clear path to profit at scale. Our economics have to make sense for the return on capital that's needed for this industry. And for those of you who've been on the fundraising circuit, the degree of scrutiny of techno-economic modeling is intense, and this is just the beginning. So we can think about costs as a function of a few major components, and there are certainly other minor ones, but raw materials, capital expenditures, and labor. And each of these represents a lever for ensuring that cell-based meat has a viable future where it can compete with conventional meat to consumers. Our economics just have to make sense. So let's start with raw materials. For decades, cell culture media, or as we call it, feed, has been used to produce very high dollar value products. It's been optimized a bit. Well, until now, the need to revolutionize it hasn't been there. As I mentioned before, the largest non-water constituent of meat is amino acids. Approximately 30% of chicken is protein. We need to be sourcing those with commodity feedstock pricing, and we need to be using them as efficiently as possible. Lysine, methionine, and glutamate are already made in several millions of tons a year for prices of approximately $1 a kilogram. The prices for other amino acids should respond similarly as their supply scales with our new demand. And when we talk about growth factors, we've talked before about the scale needed for their production, but anyone who's ever purchased 10 micrograms of a recombinant growth factor from a catalog in graduate school knows that we're, of course, doomed, right? Oh, wrong. Liz Speck from the Good Food Institute had described the cost for recombinant proteins across industrial scales, from rare drugs through industrial enzymes. For example, if you're purchasing FGF, which is a protein often required by some of our meat cells, from a catalog provider like PepperTech, their price is about $800,000 a gram. That's steep. Pricing for enzymes used in laundry detergents are approximately $10 a kilogram, and they're all proteins made recombinantly. So there's work to be done here. We might require additional purification steps or something to clean up those crude proteins for cell culture use, but we aren't stuck with the ridiculous catalog prices we see in research today. One final piece of evidence that the cost of recombinant proteins are decreasing: there are now monoclonal antibody treatments, once reserved for human cancer patients with costs of tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, that are now available for your pets. One of my close friends was recently prescribed Cytopoint which is a new medication for her itchy dog. It neutralizes an immune system molecule called interleukin-31, and it costs about $60 a dose. Certainly raises some eyebrows on your drug costs for sure, but I will leave healthcare economics as the topic for a different talk. So even as you can start to get your head around the cost of raw materials, it's still going to be imperative to use them efficiently. We need to find clever process solutions and cell feed formulations to ensure that we're translating our raw materials into meat in the most cost-effective ways. So the next big bucket to talk about that influences the cost of our product is our capital expenditure. We talked before about the scales that's going to be required for cell-based meat production in order to make a dent in the global meat consumption. That large scale starts to look like a lot of new steel in the ground. We need low-cost solutions for our equipment and utility designs, but we still have to make sure that facilities run with high success rates. We'll need to carefully consider how to ensure high success rates as we start up new facilities with larger scales and leaner designs. So I'd consider when you build, to build in a space that you have to learn and develop and react as we understand what the challenges are. Trying to thread that needle on capital cost optimization versus operational success rates requires experience and judgment to decide between the nice to haves and the must haves. We'll need to find that sweet spot and evolve new technologies and operating procedures that can go beyond the largest cell culture technologies today. There are some clues out there in sanitary design for other large scale industries in food, beverage, dairy, and fermentation. But we're going to need the engineering support to bring their best to our new facilities. So I'd pose the question to the crowd here, when you start to build, how much risk will you be willing to take on your facility design to bring down the costs? It's going to take us a while as an industry to find those new norms that work effectively for food production from mammalian and avian cells. The other area of CapEx that I'll point out are utilities. Utilities are not always as sexy as the process equipment, but we do well to look at other adjacent commodity industries and leverage best practices there that are world-class. Advanced technologies related to energy production and energy recovery can help us achieve our goals with respect to reduced environmental impact as well as cost. The third part of our cost considerations that I'll talk about today is labor. Not going to spend too much time on it other than to acknowledge that one key to efficiency here is the effective use of automation. The current state of the art of automation for biotech facilities and food production facilities is impressive and continuing to evolve at an amazing pace. I believe our production technologies and facilities will be able to leverage those automation best practices quite readily, which could help make our facilities and thus our food system not only more cost effective, but also more resistant to the kinds of worker safety concerns and meat shortages like what we saw in this COVID pandemic. I do want to acknowledge, though, that when we talk about our industry and labor, it highlights a concern that exists in the traditional animal agriculture workforce, that their jobs would be at risk as cell-based meat advances. Based on these other similar industries, we aren't that close to true lights out operation. So for the foreseeable future, cell-based meat production is an and solution to feed our growing population. And we're going to continue to need skilled, hardworking people operating in our production facilities who care about making sure that safe, high-quality food gets out to people. All right, so the third pillar I'd like to talk about today, and a place where we have spent a lot of focus at Memphis Meats, is on the regulatory pathways that will be required for oversight and compliance for our products and manufacturing. We started these conversations early with the agencies, and we continue to be impressed with the engagement, urgency, and willingness to learn by both FDA and USDA. They, of course, understand that regulation of our products is a partnership where we work together as we define and characterize our products, our processes, and our facilities. And we understand that we all benefit from the work that FDA and USDA do to ensure a safe food supply in this country and the value that has to our customers. So in 2018, Memphis Meats partnered with the North American Meat Institute in a letter advocating for how we thought the agencies should divide regulatory jurisdiction for cell-based meat. We suggested that the agencies play to their respective strengths. FDA will regulate seafood, but will also regulate the cultivation bioprocess. FDA has extensive experience and familiarity with bioreactor technology for food and pharma, and understands the relevant risk mitigations in using them. USDA would do what it does best and regulate the safety of meat and poultry products. So following harvest of our meat from the cultivation step, we hand that off to our processing team and they formulate according to USDA standards under FSIS authority. In other words, FDA handles oversight of the cultivation process and USDA handles meat and poultry processing. So how will this work in practice? The regulatory system in the US is experienced and responsive at navigating new technologies. To do this, the US government regulators have a three-step pathway for novel food products to be sold safely in this country. Step one is to establish safety using scientific data and risk assessment information. As I mentioned for cell-based meat, the FDA has jurisdiction over the determination of safety, and they will execute that through a pre-market review of our products and processes. Step two is to establish the appropriate inspection regimen and obtain a grant of inspection for your production facility. Here as well, FDA is expected to have jurisdiction for facility inspections of the cultivation process and execute them in a manner consistent with their oversight of similar fermentation-based foods that exist today. At a point where the meat is harvested from the cultivation stage and is ready for processing into meat and poultry products, then USDA will take over using their inspection procedures that are in use in facilities today for other meat and poultry manufacturers. For those of you who might not be familiar, USDA inspectors are typically on site daily during operations. For species such as seafood or game, it's generally expected that FDA will retain full oversight of those products. And step three, both FDA and USDA have a legal mandate to ensure the truthful labeling of food. Under USDA, you need to obtain a label approval for your products before they can be sold. Under FDA, you need to be compliant to labeling standards. And currently, both agencies are in talks to align on common principles for labels of cell-based meat. It's our belief, and that of the Alliance for Meat, Poultry, and Seafood Innovation, which is a recently formed coalition of 7 US cell-based meat companies, that the existing frameworks for regulating meat are sufficient for evaluating the safety and truthful labeling of cell-based meat products. I do want to throw a shout out here for this alliance and the work they're doing to build a cohesive voice to regulators so the industry can get to solutions that are effective across our different technologies we may bring to cell-based meat, poultry, and seafood. If you're interested, I'd encourage you to visit their website at ampsinnovation.org. So I say all these things about navigating the regulatory processes as if they're simply hurdles that we all have to overcome. But we do need to clearly acknowledge that the role of the FDA and the USDA, as well as other local authorities, is to ensure that the food supply is safe and truthfully labeled. People feeding their families make the assumption every day that the food they eat is safe, and it's the obligation of food producers to keep it that way. We owe that commitment to safety to everyone who will be our customers, and we owe it to each other as a group of people trying to make a better future. If we don't ensure we're putting out a safe product, it could set the entire industry back significantly. So the last step is making sure that consumers understand and are excited about what we're doing. It doesn't matter how efficient and cost-effective our technology is, or how smoothly the regulatory path functions if nobody's interested in the products. Luckily, we're starting out with a huge baseline of support. Survey research suggests that roughly 2/3 of US consumers would eat cell-based meat, and many of those consumers are already planning on eating it regularly. 60% of the American population is a pretty great early adopter segment, I'd say. The last couple years have also seen a major surge in high quality survey research done outside the US, and the findings are similar. Massive segments of the population in countries throughout the world are hungry for cell-based meat. Arguably, more importantly though, is another consistent finding. The more consumers know about cell-based meat, the more enthusiastic they are. This means that our job from a communications perspective is in part to get those conversations started and clear up any misinformation as it arises. At Memphis Meats, we wanted to start that public conversation early. We had our media debut in the Wall Street Journal when we had just 4 team members and were less than 6 months old as a company. And since then, we've regularly updated the public as we've reached milestones in product development, fundraising, regulation, and more. Communicating regularly with the public is a key part of our strategy, and it could allow us to succeed where other food innovations have struggled. But of course, the single most important thing we can do to win consumers over is to make delicious products. Wow. Those are some amazing creations from across our industry. It's clear that you all get it. People buy food that they love and that they want to eat and share with family and friends. Meat is part of the story of human evolution, and it's an intrinsic part of many cultures and traditions. If we want a place at that table, it has to be delicious. You indulge me one more moment while I geek out on the science a little bit more here today. The opportunities to learn about the things that impact meat flavor and texture are amazing in cell-based meat. To study things like the impact of grass-fed versus corn-fed beef can take months to years of raising traditional livestock and slaughtering them. We can study these kinds of things in weeks, in truly high throughput ways to ensure that the most amazing products reach our consumers. We have so much to show the world, and it's making me hungry. All right. I hope today I've been able to engage you around the strategy of reaching this monumental point of commercialization of cell-based meat with a strong foundation from these critical pillars. Becoming a significant part of the food system will require that these fundamentals are strong. As a nascent industry started just a few years ago, we've come a long way, but the biggest hills are still ahead. Launching our first products as an industry will change the world. If you're already in this field, congratulations. And if you're interested, it's an amazing space and it's going to be a wild ride. So come and join us. So thank you all for your time and attention today. I wanted to end with just showing the vision statement that we lead with at Memphis Meats, because it's important to keep this out front as we have so much to do. We envision a world where every person can eat delicious food without compromise, and the earth is thriving in harmony with a food system that sustains both its inhabitants and its environment. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the great speakers that we have at the conference this week, and I'd be happy to take a few questions through the assistance of the moderator here. And I'll stop sharing, get us back to the chat screen.
Hey everyone, thanks so much, Casey. That was a great presentation, a really great way to kick off the next couple of days, showing off a lot of the progress our field has made, so much to be excited about, so many delicious prototype photos to see.
Yeah.
Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Freya Mehta. I'm a scientist at Blue Biosciences. We are Germany and Europe's first cultivated seafood company. So I'll be sort of walking us through some of the questions that have come up, some really excellent questions from the audience. I'll try to organize it the same way you did with these 4 pillars.
Thanks.
So starting with scale, we have a great question from Brian. The question is, a company building a bioreactor beyond current proven scale will be taking a great technical risk. How large of a bioreactor is needed to achieve supply and cost goals? And what are the technical risks for such a bioreactor? And specifically for Memphis Meats, how will Memphis Meats approach that scale-up challenge?
That's a good, very multi-part question. So Absolutely. Every time you go bigger, there's risks. And I'm going to open up the chats just so I can remember all the parts of that question. But I can't see them. All right, sorry about that.
I'll point them out.
Yeah, it's okay. So, absolutely there are risks with mammalian cell culture, and then those risks are pretty well described in the literature. The things that those cell types need, in contrast in some ways to microbes, require that we pay attention to the relevant factors for their culture. The risks the company takes, in order to scale and to produce at low prices, obviously there are advantages as in both capital expenditure and labor costs, operations, as you get bigger and bigger units of operation. And at some point, you can only scale up so far, and then you start to scale out and replicate those. Exactly where that line is drawn, we're going to have to find out. And like I said, it's a question that every company is going to have to wrestle with, is how much of that facility risk and operational risk are you willing to take to try and achieve those next increments of cost efficiency. Yeah, and what was the last part of the question, Frey? Sorry.
So it was actually kind of more about Memphis Meats and how you envision your own company addressing those challenges, and maybe even the sort of specific scale that you guys are aiming for there, or that you think a company might want to aim for.
Yeah, I can't talk specifically about the scale of production at Memphis Meats, but obviously the things that I referred to today indicate that we are all going to have to go very large. But there are some really creative solutions that go beyond traditional suspension bioreactor technology. I talked about that today as an example of processes that have been scaled. But I think both scaling those technologies as well as others that might be more tailored to cell-based meat production, is something that we're exploring.
So I really like that you mentioned scale up versus scale out processes. We actually have a great question from Claire, which is exactly on this topic. Do you expect production at the scale of a single restaurant or just a few restaurants to be economically viable?
There are some really interesting cost curves from other industries that show cost of producing major commodity scale foods at different volumes of production. And as your production volumes are small, those costs are really high, and they come down significantly with scale. And a large component of that is labor. Labor scales much more efficiently as you get larger and larger. It might take 2 or 3 people to run a 500-liter bioreactor, but it doesn't take 20 or 30 people to run, a 50,000-liter bioreactor. So the costs of labor come down significantly with scale. Obviously, launching enough product where you can serve a few restaurants is an amazing step forward. And you'll have to be able in your modeling to show how those costs and the components that I mentioned, the raw material costs and the capital expenditure and the labor, how do those translate to something you'll be doing at scale? Because, we can't go broke making small amounts of cell-based meat. That's for sure. We have to have our costs in line so that we can afford to produce even at the scale that's only a few restaurants. But we don't anticipate that you achieve all of the leverage that you'll need at that relatively smaller production volume, and that there is a lot of gain to be achieved as we do get larger. So we need to be able to tell that story in a really, a really precise way as we go out to raise the money that we'll need to build those larger plants. People will have to understand as they invest in that capital expenditure, when do they break even on that? What's the return on that investment? And so we'll need to have our trajectories really mapped out and how we think about scaling our processes.
And sort of connecting the scale and cost components, when you compare, right now we're speaking about the cost to actually produce, but then when you think about the cost to sell and purchase these meats eventually, I think it's important to remember that there's a lot of government subsidies that go into meat production everywhere on Earth.
Absolutely.
And so that's kind of an important thing for us to start to, as you're mentioning, with these partnerships with regulatory agencies and with policymakers, sort of navigate how we can envision that sort of potentially aiding our industry.
Absolutely. Food production is important for every government, right? They need to ensure the food security for their people. And so just as been done here in agriculture, the government looks to ensure that those industries are viable and sustainable. And as we grow in our relevance, we certainly expect to have those conversations as well.
So this connects pretty well to a question from Carol, which is to move things to scale, does it make sense for governments to fund heavily and commit resources to help this industry sort of take off? And in turn, does the nation investing in become a global leader in this market? Do you think there are potential drawbacks from government investment in this area?
I won't say I'm not necessarily the expert in all of our government relations and interactions, but I do see a road where that will be important. I think countries around the world can choose to take a bold step forward and lead here. And there are countries where the relevance of cell-based meat production are more or less really crucial for them defining their own food security. Depending on the resources they have to support traditional agriculture or not. So I think there is an opportunity for governments to lead boldly here. Are there cons of that? I am almost certain that there are, but I don't know exactly what they are today. But clearly there are unintended consequences of almost every choice that we make.
I think it's good to be aware of this and sort of attempt to mitigate things as we learn them. But at the moment, it really seems like some involvement from both public and private funding is always going to be helpful at this stage.
Absolutely, I agree.
Let's see. We have a lot of questions coming in here.
That's an exciting topic.
Definitely. So let's maybe move a little bit to the regulatory side, so we haven't touched this part yet. Good question from Carrie, which is, how do you anticipate the regulatory aspect being different between cell-based and conventional meat production on sort of the day-to-day scale? So you're mentioning that there are inspectors who are present in a large amount of time from the USDA in meat production facilities and packing facilities. Do you envision the sort of same day-to-day interactions with cell-based meat regulation?
Yeah, we don't know 100% what FDA and USDA will do. They're actively discussing today in joint, sessions how they will regulate cell-based meat and how they will inspect facilities making cell-based meat. But the precedents today for food companies being regulated by FDA in the US, FDA does come in and inspect and ensure that those facilities are operating according to their agreements and good manufacturing practices for food. FDA typically, comes in once a year, something like that, maybe less frequently, maybe more frequently, depending on the individual product, to do an actual on-site inspection. USDA, they're there every day when you're producing meat. They're part of every shift to make sure that the meat production methods are sanitary and producing safe product. We, like I said, we can't see around every corner, but we think those paradigms likely still apply. For FDA, again, inspecting, our assumption is along the guidelines of food production and not pharma. So I talked about FDA being familiar with bioreactor technologies based and mammalian cell culture based on their expertise where that's applied today in pharma. But they also have expertise for food fermentation, beverage manufacturing, and so we expect that we'll be looking at inspection and concerns specifically related to food production from FDA.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And it's really good to make this distinction because we are sort of borrowing so much technology and expertise from pharma at this moment. It's important to realize that we're actually going to be needing to regulate this the same way we regulate food production. Even though at this scale, it really does feel closer perhaps to the pharma methodologies.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good learning and expert technological expertise there. But for us, we do think there are some separations and some different kinds of issues between making drugs and making food. And bioreactors for mammalian cell cultures and fermentation for microbes are not that different. And fermenters are being used to make food, globally. So while people sometimes think about this with a, especially at smaller scales with kind of a pharma lens, I think there are many analogies of fermentation for food that are really relevant, for FDA to draw upon, and other global regulators as well.
And kind of connected to that, great question from Sam here. What are other lessons that you think we can learn from microbial fermentation? Are there any processes that you personally are excited about but haven't seen really being implemented in this field or at scale?
Yeah, so microbial processes are used to make food and other commodity products at massive scales, and they have, they've taken that next leap in how to push the cost of operation down to commodity production methods. So I think there are a lot of things we can stand to learn from our friends in microbial production. Some of that benefit is from the scales they've been able to attain, and I think we have to continue to, step forward in scale of production. Like I said, we haven't hit the edge yet. I was in one of the facilities that started up the first 20,000 liter bioreactors as part of a project I was working on, and everybody was like, "Oh my God, 20,000 liters, that's so risky." And it worked the first time. And then people built the 25,000 liter bioreactors, and everybody was so nervous, and it worked. And it doesn't mean it was easy. There were a lot of smart engineers and people working and testing and considering all the possible risks, but it keeps working. So, there are hurdles to overcome. We're going to need to innovate. I would say, just on my experience, that, the biopharma industry, because of the nature of the products they produce, is relatively conservative. They've got belts and suspenders and trench coats and all the layers of things that they need to produce really clean products, because those products get injected directly into you. We're making food, and it has to be safe. That is paramount. But there's precedent for making safe food using fermentation at massive scales. So, I think we can definitely stand to leverage some of their production technologies. And, we've got at Memphis Meats, really a couple of really good engineers from the food and beverage industry who are thinking about operating at massive scales and who have done that before. And they bring such a unique lens to a conversation of how we think about technologies for scaling cell-based meat. So, encourage you guys to reach out to these adjacent industries, talk to their engineers, talk to their scientists, figure out, what are those big technology advances that they've put in place to allow them to come down that cost curve and still remain safe.
Speaking of safety, we have a lot of questions here about contamination risks in bioreactors. So could you maybe comment on, because you mentioned that we have a great history of producing a lot of products for both food and pharma in large-scale bioprocess with a very sort of low rate, theoretically, of contamination and infection. But could you maybe speak to that a little bit? What actually is the risk of potential contaminants?
Yeah. This is my estimation, but I think, globally large-scale mammalian cell culture facilities that are running well, probably in the low single digits on contamination rates. That's my approximation. I don't have the numbers for that, but having seen it, that's my guess. Most of those facilities are operating without antibiotics. Their procedures, their equipment is built to maintain a sanitary environment inside of those vessels. And they've developed those procedures over decades, and they're very robust and reliable. So I absolutely intend that we can leverage those best practices to maintain also low risk of contamination in our culture environments. That's something that we're thinking about every day as we design our process equipment. What are those best practices in equipment design and hygienic design that we can, that we can leverage, to be sure that we're producing clean, safe product, but we don't have to reinvent every wheel. This is done really well. So, like I mentioned, most typically, large-scale mammalian cell culture processes are, like I said, are not being done with antibiotics, and we don't think we'll need that either. And we think that also contributes to safety, that we aren't dumping large amounts of antibiotics into the water systems and enhancing the risk of these superbugs. So so we think producing meat with cell-based meat technologies, can be very, very safe and can also be a benefit, to the general environmental safety.
Definitely, it's a huge potential advantage for us, and it's really great to hear that you, with your widespread experience in this industry, can sort of vouch that the bioprocess is adding a lot to the safety of these products.
Absolutely.
Another question, sort of coming in the direction of safety again, but at a sort of difference from a different angle. What are your thoughts on the safety of genetically engineered cells for cultured meat, specifically because Memphis Meat is potentially using genetically engineered cells as well? And how do you have any opinions about the EU's resistance to genetically engineered food products?
At Memphis Meats, we're open to all of the tools in a toolbox that could help us make safe, delicious products in this alternative method for making meat. We haven't made firm decision on what product we'll launch first and whether it will incorporate this technology, but we're certainly exploring all the options here. I think there's precedent for safe use of genetically modified foods in plants, and the Aqua Bounty salmon and cases like that. There's a safe trajectory that we've come from for use of genetically modified foods. So we're certainly evaluating it. It can be a useful tool to make the products, not only highly efficient to produce, but also safe and also healthy. There are things that we consider about, making products that have healthy fat distributions, things like that, that can help take our food to a new level of safety and health considerations. Like I said, we obviously haven't launched our product yet and commercially, and so like I said, we're still evaluating all those tools in our toolbox, but it's certainly on the table for us.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but definitely.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, definitely important to consider, I think, for a lot of the cultured meat companies in the space, to consider all the tools in the toolbox. And this, what you mentioned earlier, that the sort of oversight from federal agencies is actually quite strict. So I think these safety concerns that we have at the moment, when this is maybe a sort of far away thing to imagine the production, it might be mitigated by just good old fashioned regulatory oversight.
Yeah, those are conversations that that we're continuing to have and evaluate with the regulatory authorities.
Yeah. To sort of get a bit general, since we're coming to the end of our question and answer session, and we have some great questions that don't really fit into the pillars, but I think would be nice for you to answer as well. So one is a great one from Tom Ben Air, which is, what open access research do you think would help the cultivated meat industry the most?
Ooh. There's a couple of things I think about. One, when we look at the bench scale research that needs to be done on some of these novel meat cultivation techniques, you see things on 3D printing and vasculature and scaffolding. I think those have quite some way to come before we can make a clear case that we're ready to implement something like that. And so, where a lot of that work is being done in academic institutions, we're certainly following it all and looking to how it could help us make better and more cost-effective and safer products. I think there's also a lot of really interesting research to be done around the composition and efficient use of the cell feeds. So all of our nutrients that we supply to our cells, and they're common things. They're amino acids and vitamins and glucose, trace elements. They're the things that we eat and that cows and chickens eat. But how to, produce those in ways that are really well balanced for the cells that we are feeding them to, so that they use them as efficiently as possible. And how we get cells really consuming on an efficient basis more crude nutrients, such as hydrolysates or byproducts from the agriculture industry today, corn steep liquors and things like that. Microbes are very good at eating like almost anything. Mammalian cells are a little more picky. So how do we prepare those things in a way that makes them really available to mammalian cells? Those are things that I think about a lot, and excited to see the evolving research on it.
Kind of going off of that, just a personal question: how do you envision sort of public or private partnerships between companies and academic researchers who are operating at really different time scales? Because some of these things you're describing are research questions that take a much longer time scale to resolve than companies' R&D department might be interested in investing. So do you think that there's room for dedicated partnerships there?
Yeah, I think so. In a company, especially with very small companies like most of us are today, it's really difficult to try and do everything at once and to preserve resources for things that are those we call them blue sky, and we the things that we know are on the trajectory. They're just a little ways down the road from us. It's always hard to carve out those resources compared to the get product out the door as fast as we can, get ready to produce. And everyone who's in the lab doing that future research, it's really hard not to say, can you guys come and help us? We have so much to do. And so where companies, and that is true across like all industries, it's really hard to carve out that research component. And so I think, having some partnerships, having that agreed, way that we might can tap into some of that research with a longer trajectory, is a really great idea for how it can be run a little bit adjacent to maybe the most mainline pressing things that have to be done today, tomorrow, and the next day, but still, keep it integrated in what we do, because I am certainly humble enough to know that however we produce food today, like 10 years from today, we'll be like, oh my God, I can't believe we thought that was like the thing. So, we have to keep our heads up and our eyes down the road, because this field is really in its infancy, and the trajectory and the pace of change is going to be massive.
And coming off of that, for our last question, I really like to hear your sort of enthusiasm for where this is going and for the work that is yet to be done. So coming from John, here's a question about how you can envision people who are excited about this field, who've seen the progress and want to be part of it in the future. How can you give any advice to people who are not PhD level scientists, are talented in other areas, for example, like operations, to get involved in this field and these companies?
Yeah, to me, that's part of what's exciting. We've all started maybe at that bench scale research, but to commercialize these products, we need people who are great at operations. We need people who are great at putting product out the door. And a lot of our companies are very research based, and a lot of our leaders in these companies, not so many of them have been part of a company that's just putting product out the door every day. And there's skill and technique and expertise in doing that and making that happen that we have to bring into our companies. We're not going to do this. We're not going to make meat globally with a bunch of, PhD students pipetting in very large scale bioreactors. It doesn't work that way. We need to think about what are the metrics that you use to make sure that you have, lean, efficient processes that are, like I said, highly consistent product going out the door every day. So, a lot of my past was in companies making product and seeing every day the folks working on the floor, organizing that, making sure that we have supply chains for raw materials, making sure that we have quality programs that allow us to make, assess, and release product. So I'm super excited for the next stage. I think that influx of professionals from those industries is going to really help us take this to the next level. So I would say, reach out to companies that are ready to take this next step, because we're excited to be hiring experienced operations professionals as well. Thanks.
Great. I feel like it's a great place to sort of end the discussion now, since we're running up on time. Thank you so much for your talk and your answers, Casey. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you guys so much for your excitement and for hosting this conference. Looking forward to seeing some other of the great talks and contributions.